Good morning. It's 10:30, and if we don't start now, how will people know that they're late?
Exactly.
I need to begin by telling a story that's told about a preacher in the Dakotas. He was assigned to a rural parish, and there are some terrible winter storms up there. And there was a terrible blizzard. He made his way to the church, and one cowboy showed up. One. And he said to the cowboy, "Well, do you think we ought to go ahead with the service?" And the cowboy said, "Well, if I go out to feed the cattle and only one shows up, I still feed him." Well, this encouraged the young preacher, so he got up and really gave it a rip, gave it his best effort. When he was done, he asked the cowboy, "Well, how was it?" And the cowboy said, "Well, when I go out to feed the cattle and only one shows up, I don't give them the whole load." And I'm tempted to give you the whole load, but I don't think I will. I found a lot of interesting things out about this congregation's history, and discovered, for example, a book that had all the trustee minutes from 1886 to 1933. And those minutes were very enlightening. And one of the enlightenments I had was I really wish they'd given the secretary of the trustees handwriting lessons. There are some amazing documents that are in the history cabinets upstairs. And I kind of got lost in them. I'm going to try to not give you the stuff that you're not interested in. This is primarily a talk about this sanctuary, but the realization I came to as I went through the history is that our congregation and its antecedents have actually been in 6 worship spaces. 6 worship spaces. This is the 6th worship space. And I'm going to spend most of the time talking about this sanctuary and this church, but I want to give you a brief history of some of the other spaces, and I'm probably only 5 or 10 minutes. First thing you need to appreciate is just how our antecedents in the faith in Worcester were out really on the frontier. In 1787, the Congress, not the one under the Constitution, but the one under the Articles of Confederation, approved the Northwest Ordinance, which made provision for the area north and west of the Ohio River to be formed eventually into states. There were to be no more than 5 and no less than 3 states developed in the Northwest Territory. And those states today are Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a little chunk of Minnesota were in the Northwest Ordinance. And to show you how frontierish this was, now we say our congregation began in 1811, and I know there were Methodists worshiping in Worcester in 1811, but it's a little sketchy because our church was not actually chartered by the state until 1819. But I want to begin by showing you Wayne County. When the Northwest Ordinance was established, there were 13 counties established for the area. And this is Wayne County in 1787.
It was huge. Yeah.
It goes all the way upper and lower peninsula of Michigan, past the Chicago area. And can you see the little brown speck in the right-hand corner? Lower right-hand corner?
That's where
This is Wayne County today.
Oh.
So one of the 13 counties established was Wayne, and I suspect that's why Michigan has a Wayne County as well.
That's right.
In the census of 1800, that whole area, including Northwest Ohio and Michigan, parts of Wisconsin, Illinois, the census of 1800 showed in that whole area there were only 3,206 settlers in that whole area. Now, one of the sources I looked at, obviously there are conflicting sources you get when you go back that far because everything is kind of fuzzy. But supposedly in 1800, in the Wooster area, in what's now Wayne County, one of the sources identified that there were, I gotta check my notes, that there were 45 households in what is now Wayne County. Just 45, which equal 300 people, and 22 of those households lived within 3 miles of what is now Wooster. So Wooster kind of became the center of some of these settlements. This era was still a very dangerous time for settlers. There were 2 forts that were built to settlers could flee to if there was conflict with the Native Americans. One of them was where the Lutheran church is right now. Another fort was out near where Oak Chapel is. And this was especially important because in the War of 1812, the British enlisted Native Americans to fight against the settlers. And in the documents I've looked at, there are massacres in both directions during that era. Families wiped out, Indian villages pillaged, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very difficult and chancy time. The next picture I want to show you is Ohio in 1814. Now, most of the development of the state of Ohio in these years was in the south, and there's a reason for that. There were no roads, and so most settlement happened along the rivers. So all the tributaries of the Ohio were where the settlements happened first. There were a series of, I think my memory serves me correct, 65 forts along these rivers where settlers could seek refuge if they needed it. And that line, where the blue area is approximately the watershed line between the Ohio River system and the Lake Erie system. So the settlement happened in the southern part of the state first. The Northwest Ordinance provided that when the population got to 50,000, they could make a state. And so this is Ohio in 1814. And the blue area, which is where Wayne County is, has another label on it, Indian lands. So this was really Native American territory at this time. We say our congregation began in 1811. This is in that era where everything was very, very chancy. And so the congregation that began to form here, before the congregation, people usually met at camp meetings. That's when settlers would gather together, they'd go to a grove, and they'd have like a 3-day picnic, revivals, et cetera, et cetera. People would be converted. There was a lot of emotionalism to it, and obviously it was one of the ways people socialized in an area where there was nobody. By 1811, we know that there was preaching, Methodist preaching going on in Wooster from a number of sources. There was not a regular circuit preacher here until 1816. And in 1819, the Methodists in Wooster formed the first congregation, the Church of the Tabernacle, is what they called it. And they met at a log building that is, hang on a second, a log building which is at the northeast corner of North and Grant Street. That's where the Justice Center is right now. That was the first location. And that property was given to them by Joseph H. Larwell, who was the Wayne County Clerk of Courts. Now, before we talk about the various sanctuaries, let's talk about the sanctuary itself. God is everywhere. But sanctuaries become important to us because they become the place where we intentionally experience God through worship, through singing, through the hymns, through the sacraments. And sanctuaries become important to us because they're the places where notable moments happen in our lives, like the baptism of our children, marriages, memorializing those who have died. And so people become very attached to the structures because their memories are attached to the structures. And that's one reason it's so hard in an era that's changing for small churches to give up their sanctuary and merge with others, because the space becomes very special to them. And you'll see as we move along here that the space is very important in a number of ways. They met in a log house at the corner of Larwell and Grant Street until 1825, when they built a small brick structure that was a story and a half. And they met there. And one of the things I want to talk about as we go along is what the experience was like in those sanctuaries. From 1825 to 1839-40, they met in that structure, that brick structure. The men sat on one side of the sanctuary. The women sat on another side of the sanctuary. The front row of the women's section was the Hallelujah section. Front row of the men's was the Amen corner. And it was all a cappella singing. All a cappella singing. No instrumentation. And the congregation began to grow. And by 1830, they had 60 members. And in 1839, they decided the building was not adequate. And so the log structure is the first church, first sanctuary. 1825 to 1840 is the second. The third one was built on the same spot. They tore the building down, built up another one, and that structure stood until 1886 when it burned down in a fire. And I'll talk about that in a minute. During that era, they were so concerned about a cappella singing that part of the Sunday school time was devoted to teaching the children to sing properly. 20 minutes of every Sunday school was devoted to teaching the children to sing. This was an era when not only was there not instrumentation, but there were no choirs, because some of them thought that having designated singers was unspiritual. There are always controversies in congregations, aren't there? The congregation, before I leave that, I want to tell you that this little church here produced 3 bishops for the Methodist Episcopal Church, the one that was over on Larwell and Grant. Let me get to their names, because... first of all, I wanted to tell you something about the church there. It was heated by wood and lit by candles. So imagine worshiping by candlelight every Sunday. The 3 bishops are Bishop Edward Thompson. Edward Thompson was a physician who was a skeptic, a religious skeptic, was converted by the congregation, served as their pastor for 3 years, became the founding president of Ohio Wesleyan University, and in 1864 was elected a bishop. The second person that little group produced as a bishop was W.O. Harris, who was the pastor from 1838 to 39 in that little church. He was elected bishop. And the third was Bishop McConnell, whose father was the pastor there, and he went to school in Wooster and later became a bishop. So that little congregation produced a lot of leaders for the church. Things went along well. The congregation was still growing. Oh, I should tell you one of the other cultural aspects of these early congregations. In Ohio, the only organized groups against John Barleycorn were the Methodists. You know who John Barleycorn is? Whiskey. Alcohol. It was a very strong temperance movement. Bishop Asbury was extremely strong in the temperance line. I grew up in a Methodist church that was in a township that is still dry, and we had temperance sermon every single year, and we're asked to take the pledge, et cetera, et cetera. Some of you probably understand what I'm saying, don't you? Have you ever been part of that kind of congregation? Yep. Okay, things went along pretty well. The church kept growing until 1872, and then there was a split. And it was rancorous. Some of the rationale for the congregation splitting, see, congregations split back then too. Part of the rationale for the split is hidden because some documents were burned in the fire in 1886. But it centers around a pastor named G.W. Pepper, who had conflict with the board and agreed to leave at annual conference time, and then he refused to leave at annual conference time. And I thought it was just because he was rebellious against the order and discipline of the church, but it turned out his daughter, his beautiful daughter, caught smallpox at annual conference time, and he refused to move. I can understand that. Well, the whole group left with G.W. Pepper, and for 2 years they worshiped in the Episcopal Church, which was vacant at the time. For 1872 to 1874, they worshiped there. They were they called themselves the Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church, and the church that was Church of the Tabernacle changed its name to First Methodist Episcopal Church. And so for 14 years, the two groups were separate. The group that was the Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church, in the 2 years they were in the Episcopal Church, they built on this site, the following congregation. They built a sanctuary, and this, I found the floor plan, I couldn't find an actual picture of it. It was exactly opposite of this. The pulpit was at that end, this was the entrance end. And there's something significant about this in relation to what I told you about the one that was First Methodist. You know there's no center aisle? How do you separate the men and the women if there's no center aisle? And this was a radical departure in another way, and that is, you can't read it, but this says organ. They had an organ. And in those days, many of these churches thought that organs were of the devil. Sorry, Steve. Organs were of the devil.
Probably brings people in.
And it was a small pipe organ. And in the financial records that I've combed through in that era, I found that they were not only paying an organist, but they were paying an organ pumper. Now, when I heard that, I thought of the organ my Aunt Ruby had in her parlor, where you did the pedals. But that's a reed instrument. That is not a pipe instrument. And so I did some research, and I want to show you an organ pumper.
And this is just its own pipe organ.
This is the oldest playing pipe organ in Chicago.
Wow.
It's from 1850. There you go. Somebody has to pump the air. There was no electricity in 1850.
Is this
You
fine?
got it.
Okay. Sounds great too.
1850.
That's amazing.
I love the you have to pump it.
These guys get a little goofy, so we'll leave them be. But you can see what a radical departure this is culturally from what they'd experienced before with the a cappella singing. The church that they built, I'm going to go back to the picture of the church they built. The church, the Trinity Methodist Church, which faced this way, had, and also on the far side of the chancel, had the Sunday school rooms, a library, and an ever-flowing fountain. And in the basement, they had Saturday suppers, and they had spelling bees. People paid 10 cents to come to have supper and a spelling bee, and there was no offering. So this was their attraction. Okay, things went along swell until 1886. And on February 28, 1886, First Methodist Church was meeting. And the Sunday school superintendent had just written on the blackboard, God works in strange ways, his wonders to perform. And somebody shouted, the church is on fire. And the church, it was a winter day, and they heated the stove too hot, and the stovepipe caught the roof on fire. And because of a problem with the water mains and the fire truck getting there, the thing burned. And I actually found a picture of the burned out church. This is the burned out church in 1886, First Methodist Episcopal. And as the fire was raging, people from Trinity ran over to help, and on the way back had a discussion that maybe they ought to invite the people at First Church to worship with them. And it's amazing to me when I see how rancorous this split was in 1872, how quickly these two congregations got together, because that happened February 28th, the fire. And by the April district meeting, they had merged. They had taken the insurance from the property there, and they decided that they would come together. And they soon figured out that the two churches together were way too big for the structure I showed you before. Way too big for this structure. And so they decided they would tear it down to the ground and build what we have now. And that brings us to our sanctuary now. It was, by all accounts, and from everything I could read, an unbelievably unconflicted time. When they decided to build this sanctuary, there were a few people who left because of the expense of it, and there were a few people who refused to join later because of the expense of it. And one of the reasons you may say, well, why was that? This was back in the day where they published what everybody gave to the church. I mean, they literally published what everybody gave to the church. It took 14 years to pay off this sanctuary, and I came across a document of the pledges for the last campaign. Everybody is named, and the amount they're giving is listed. There were people who were a dime a week pledger for 2 years. There were people who were a nickel a week pledger for 2 years. There were people who were a penny a week pledgers for 2 years. You have to understand that inflation hadn't hit back then. When they tore this church down, that organ became the first organ in this sanctuary. And so they had to have it removed and stored until this was built, and it cost them $6 to remove the organ and store it. Wow. To survey this lot cost them $1. It was a different time. This sanctuary with furnaces was built for $26,000. That was a lot of money back then, a lot of money. And it was one of the grandest churches in Northeast Ohio. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but I just want to tell you that it was a huge deal when this church was dedicated in 1887. The records show that 2,000 people showed up for the dedication. A bishop from San Francisco, now remember there's no air travel then, it's like a week's trip back and forth from San Francisco. The bishop of San Francisco came to preach. I found actually a copy of his transcribed sermon, which was pretty flowery. He began by comparing the sanctuary to a work of Michelangelo. It was a different era. Anyway, so let's talk about this sanctuary, which is then the sixth building our congregation has worshiped in. And I'm going to show you some pictures, but I want you to begin to appreciate what the experience was like when this sanctuary first opened. It would be entirely different than what you're experiencing now in so many ways. I need to kind of go through the ways in which this has all changed. First of all, it's 1886. There are no electric lights here. And so the sanctuary, I'm going to show you a picture from 1898. The sanctuary was lit by three sources, and the first source was a chandelier, a gas chandelier that hung from here. And you can see the bright lights up there. There were 36 gas lamps on that chandelier. And that chandelier hung in the sanctuary until 1917. In February of 1917, the trustees voted to have it removed. I can't find, I haven't been diligent enough to find when other lighting was put up, but the chandelier was here until 1917. Now, I want you to, the more I look at this picture, the more I see things I didn't see before. The placement of the chandelier meant that the chancel and choir loft were brightly lit. The back of the sanctuary was not as heavily lit. Notice how dim it seems to the back? It's almost like being in a theater where the spotlights are in the front. So, this, by the way, was what you can see on here. In April of 1898, Company D of the 8th Ohio, 2 days before they left for the front for the Spanish-American War, heard a sermon here. And that's why all the American flags are there. Now let me begin to talk about some of the very distinctive things about this sanctuary. First of all, what we call the sanctuary was actually two entirely different spaces. Up until that wall there, that was the sanctuary. And what's now pews in the back was the Sunday school space. And it was separated by pocket doors that came out of those walls on both sides. And by measuring the distance, there have to be 3 pocket doors on each side for them to close the space. I don't know whether there was a track above and below, as there are in some churches. I'm told that the pocket doors are still in the wall, and if you tap on that column, you'll see it's just a veneer. So they're probably back in there. This church was built on what's called the Akron Plan, which was a short wide sanctuary and a Sunday school attached. It's called the Akron Plan because the first church designed this way was Akron First United Methodist Church. And you'll find Akron Plan churches, Methodist churches, all over the place. One of the, I think, most stunning examples I've seen is in Ravenna, because the Sunday school area there has actually wooden doors on all the classrooms. Up here, there were 4 classrooms in what's now the balcony. Remember that the elevator shaft was not there, so there's more space back in there. And the sound room, and over here, and the meeting room for the rest of the Sunday school was in the middle there. And so the experience on Sunday morning was very different, in part because this is 64 feet by 64 feet. 64 feet wide, 64 feet long. And there was no sound system, obviously. The pulpit was high and would be back about where the bell tables are now, probably higher than the bell table. And the pews were semicircular, as you see here. And they were much closer together than they are now, because when I was pastor, we decided to give people 3 more inches of legroom in each pew. So we took out a full pew all the way across here and a full pew all the way across to the back. The pews, this is, by the way, is pew D. A, B, and C are in the balcony now. This is pew E, because of the pin on each side is pew E. In fact, I even went up in the balcony and took a few pictures. This is in the balcony, row B, and row C in the balcony. There were others taken out, and some are stored somewhere, but I don't know where. Let me talk a little bit. I've talked about the lighting of the chandelier. There were 2 other sources of light. Do you see the hexagon on the ceiling in what was the Sunday school area? That was a skylight. When I was first here, I was taken up into the attic of the church, which is a scary place, very scary place. And the structure that fed the light down to that was still there. I took our current pastor, David Wilcox, up into that area, we survived. And unfortunately, wanted to take a picture of the structure that was in the attic, but it's been taken down because when they did air conditioning remodeling, after I left as pastor, they took it down to make room for the air conditioning units. There was another source of light besides the chandelier and the skylight, and that's the windows. I want to talk a little bit about stained glass windows and then talk a little bit about these. Stained glass windows, if you go to Europe, all the medieval cathedrals have stained glass windows that seem very blue. When they were new, they probably had more red in them, but the red dyes didn't last as long. The goal was that light coming through the stained glass windows would produce white light inside the sanctuary. The stained glass windows in cathedrals also had another purpose. Now remember, many of them were built at a time of illiteracy, and that is that the windows told stories, Bible stories, showed Bible figures, etc. And these windows are more typical of what you would have found in England in the 1700s. They're more geometric in their design, and the geometric designs have more significance than you might realize. There are lots of triangles, which are Trinity signs, and the square ones symbolize the earth. Think about the four corners of the world, north, south, east, west. And there are lots of floral designs as well. There are a few symbols. There are no stories or biblical characters, but there are symbols at the top. You see a chalice over here, the Ten Commandments there, the dove of the Holy Spirit there, and up here you have a dove, a Bible, cross and crown, lily, which is Easter, and there's a lily over there, which is Easter. So the windows had less of a story to tell outright. And the best window, you can't even see. When you design a sanctuary, where would you put the best window? Right over the altar. The facade we have here didn't exist. And what's now the pipe chamber had the choir loft in it. But if you were sitting here, you would look up, you'd see the preacher, you'd look up, you'd see the choir, and then you would see the window that is on Market Street. March and I took this picture during Wooster Fest from the outside. I tried unsuccessfully to get a picture of it from the outside backlit in the evening, but the pipe chamber obscures all light, won't go through. So, and this is the Trinity window, and you'll see inside the circle there are three smaller circles, and inside each smaller circle there are three smaller circles. And all of the symbolism is Trinity. It's called the Trinity window. And I don't think it's any accident that one of the two congregations that merged was the Trinity congregation. But it was the better window. And when the pipes were up in 2012-13, being refurbished, I did see it from the inside, and it really is quite a beautiful window. It's a shame it's the one window we'll never see again because of the pipe chamber. I'm kind of off my schedule here, but let me just see. Well, you know, there is another purpose for stained glass windows. It blocks out the world. You don't see the world. I've preached in a number of sanctuaries that are really like New England congregational, and they're very austere, no color on the walls, and clear windows, and you see the world passing by. Sanctuary is a place where you are secure from the world, and so that's one of the purposes. Remember when we had the stained glass windows out, what did we do? Mm-hmm. We actually painted those clear windows. In fact, somebody said, I wish you knew stained glass windows. But stained glass windows have a purpose. The little organ lasted until 1904. And then it was replaced. And let me show you a picture. Let's see here. I think This one probably is the best. This is a Lion Healy organ. And this other thing that this picture shows, what we see as the front of the sanctuary now didn't exist until about 1950. From 1886 till 1950, there was a very short platform on which the pulpit stood in the middle. I mean, it was a very, probably less than 6 feet platform. And then there was a paneling behind the pastor, and above that paneling sat the choir, and above that choir was paneling behind them, and then the organ pipes that you see here. And this organ, hang on a second, I think I passed the, Lion Healy pipe organ was, quote, a thing of beauty and a joy forever. And it lasted for about 50 years. That was the second organ that we had in the space. Let me talk a little bit about the chancel area now. This is a close-up of what the chancel looked like. You can see the organ pipes at the top of the picture. The pastor had the pulpit in the middle with a bench behind him. And you see a communion rail, a semicircular communion rail. Now, imagine, and this was probably the way it was from 1886 to 1951. When you had communion, you came forward and you knelt to receive communion. It's a very different experience than the way we do it now. I'm assuming after some changes I'll show you were made, that probably communion was done by passing the trays in the pews. Anybody here been here long enough? Did you pass the elements in the pews? Okay, that's the way it happened. And now we do it a different way. And but this shows you the basic, and right in the front of the pulpit was the communion table altar. Now, there's a lot about the way the geography of the sanctuary is made that says something theologically. I've been in Catholic churches where there's the nave where the congregation sits, and the middle of the transept is where the communion table is, where the sacrament is done, and then there is a rood screen, which is like a lattice, and behind the lattice is the altar. And that says something theologically. God is so above us that we can't get close. And that's why you pray to the saints, because they can get beyond that screen that you can't get beyond. Protestants have a very different perspective on our closeness and approach to God. And also, I think the geography of the sanctuary says something when the pulpit is the centerpiece. It says, the preaching of the pastor is the centerpiece of what happens. And I don't know about you, when I was growing up, I heard some really long sermons. Really long sermons. And it was a different era. But this is what this front of the sanctuary looked like until 1951. In 1951, 52, remodeling was done to put up a facade in front of the pipes that you see now, and change the sanctuary. The pulpit was moved over here to the left, and there was a lectern over there. And for a time, there was a divided chancel. You can see that the facade, this is 1951, 52, or excuse me, this was the change made in 1951, 52. This picture is actually from between 1965 and 1972, because the pastor you see at the pulpit is Tom Cromwell. Anybody here when Tom Cromwell was pastor? Okay, a number of you remember him. And the chancel was divided, and so the choir was divided and faced each other. Verna Olenslager has told me that on the right-hand side were the sopranos, On the left-hand side were the other three parts. And then she showed me something I had not noticed in the photograph. Look just over Tom Cromwell's left shoulder, you see a little head. You see that? Over Tom Cromwell's shoulder? That's the organ. The organ console was behind the sopranos. And it stayed there until 1975 when the organ was rededicated because they added 2 new stops and made some other technical modifications. And I think they were given a couple more octaves of bells at the same time. So there was a big rededication in 1975, and that's when the console made its way down here for Steve.
Yes.
I had an experience of this in the 1990s. I was at Rockport and Rocky River, and they got a new organ that had the capacity to record. And so the organist and I had an experiment. She took vacation and pre-recorded the entire service, including prelude, the introductory verse before the congregation sang, all the verses of each hymn, the doxology, the Gloria Patri, and the postlude. And I did the service all alone. I said, I didn't know you could play that. But it's a wonderful tool. I think you do the Christmas open house pre-recorded, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. There are a lot of other issues that I could talk about, but I see we've gone on almost 50 minutes already. Little things that maybe you don't pay attention to, but see all the florets along the balcony up there? Originally, when people came in here, when the church was first built, those were all highlighted in a different color. It's just a little visual touch. And you'll notice that the balcony rails have all been extended. Now Nathan Green told me he could remember when that was done, and obviously it was done for safety reasons. If you've ever been up in the balcony, before that extension was on there, it was a little scary walking along the front. And of course we now have an elevator. We now have a tech room. We now have screens. The worship space we're in has changed over the years, and I just want you to be aware, we all need to be aware, that it will keep changing. Remember the hassle over whether or not you can have an organ in church back when Trinity split off? That was because organs were seen as of the devil. And why? Because they were new. I can remember in the 1990s when praise songs became a part of our worship, and people were extremely reactive to that, including me, because it was different. One of the things we need to remember is that worship keeps evolving, and the spaces in which we worship will keep evolving too. We've been in 6 sanctuaries. This is the 6th sanctuary, and this sanctuary hasn't stayed the same. It's changed. We've modified it in a number of ways. We have a sound system. The first sound system was put in 1937. Until then, there was no sound system. But with the pulpit high in the middle, the preacher wasn't more than 40 feet from anybody in the congregation. But now we have a sound system. I do not know what changes lie ahead. But I think we need to remember, we need to be open to the possibility that the changes that happen might need to happen. I certainly would not want to be sitting in the pews that were 3 inches shorter knee room anymore. Now, I've forgotten some of the stuff I was going to say, and that's okay. I wonder if you have any questions that I might be able to answer, or you might be able to stump me with, okay?
Well, first of all, I got confused on the 2 churches that merged. Okay, the Episcopal Church,
That was simply a venue where they worshiped for a while.
right, okay, they were over there. But
Okay.
then, that one burned down.
First church is still over by the Justice Center.
Right, and then was there another Methodist church here that had built?
No, it was the one that broke away and worshiped for 2 years there while the first sanctuary was built here. And then when the 2 churches got together after the fire, They tore this down.
Yeah, but where was the other church?
The other church?
Yeah, I want to know, there were two churches.
Trinity
And I'm
and
just
First.
confused about where each one of those were.
Okay. First Methodist, Church of the Tabernacle or First Methodist, same group of
Okay.
people, were always over.
And Longwell.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And Trinity, when they broke away, they had to have a place to meet. The Episcopal Church was empty at the time. So for 2 years, while their first sanctuary was built here, they worshiped in that building. But
And
it's
then
still
that building,
right.
and then Trinity asked them to come here.
Invited them to come
And,
back.
okay, I got
And
it.
I'm shocked at how quickly it got back together. The fire was February 28th. By the March-April meeting of conference, they were one congregation again. And by May, the trustees were planning this sanctuary because they knew it was the first building was not big enough for everybody.
What were
Yes.
they called when they merged?
Pardon?
What name were they called when they merged?
They were called Wooster Methodist Episcopal Church.
Okay. The other name.
But no First or no Trinity.
And then the work along the frontier.
That was done in 75. Some of it was, no, it was done in 75 when the console was moved down over here. Because these panels were not original to the sanctuary. Yeah. Yes, Nancy?
When did the Sunday school area get changed to pews for the?
That I haven't come across. One of the things that happened that I didn't mention, in 1927 is when the wing that has Wesley Hall and the gymnasium was built. And they also did some work here. The pipes were exposed, but they moved them back so that they could put another row for the choir. Because the choir at that time had 51 members. And when they had a dedication event, I think I told you yesterday, they had, every choir member was named in the bulletin. There were 20 sopranos, 14 altos, 9 tenors, and 8 basses. And the bulletin says, carefully selected singers. When this sanctuary was dedicated in 1887, they performed Gloria from Mozart's 12th Mass, which is a piece about 4 minutes long, Nancy? That's 4 minutes long. And it's a challenging piece. You could go online and see it performed by others, but I'm amazed that they pulled that off, to be honest with you. It's quite something. But the thing that I think shocks me the most is that for the better part of 65 years, there was no chancel like this. It was a platform for the pulpit, and the choir was then above that. There was paneling behind the pastor and the pulpit, and paneling behind the choir up above. And when they did the 1827 renovation, as I look at the picture, in fact, let me get that picture. You can see that the choir is almost like they're in a shell that projects out, because the walls, they're back further into what we call a pipe chamber now. And so it must have projected out. And you can see that they did have electric lights there. This is 1927. Any other questions? Yeah.
You had one picture up there, but that showed the chancellor. It
Closer?
had it where the rail was. Yeah, that one. Am I recognizing that table and the are they the same?
I do not know.
I mean, they sure look the same.
Baptismal font.
And what does the
looked
table
like.
say? In remembrance of me?
Yeah.
And we have a table that says in remembrance of me, and that's why I'm wondering if they're not the same.
They very well could be.
Yeah, and that picture was when?
The picture was taken before remodeling in 1951.
In 1951, so.
But you see behind the choir loft, there is the panel. So there's a hard wall behind the choir, and the walls of the chancel is projecting out. Oh, I forgot about the pianos too. We have two pianos here now. Nancy could tell you, second piano we got since I've been here. Did we get the second?
So one was from Marlea Crum,
Okay.
that one. And then this one, Stephen brought from, well, he was instrumental in bringing it from
College
First
Wooster.
Methodist.
Oh,
Sorry, no,
First Press?
First,
No.
no, Westminster,
Oh, what's
by the
that?
college.
Okay.
Yeah, the story behind that one is a short story, is that they actually moved it down the street from the college into Westminster, or vice versa. Yeah, but then we were able to acquire it.
Very few sanctuaries have two pianos like
And
that.
they're both Steinways.
They're both
So that's
Steinways.
even more unusual.
The one from the college, or from Westminster came first. And then
Marlea's.
Marlea's,
Right.
and I've been, were you here then?
I was, yeah.
Okay. We didn't know, as I remember, we didn't know how to tell her we don't need it. Because this had been in, Porter's and Marlea's plans all along, that the church would get it, but, I know some people.
But we found ways to use it.
Oh, I know, but some people thought, we don't need it. Yeah, it's extra.
Now, there are a lot of details I've forgotten to tell you, but you wouldn't be interested in them anyway. It's amazing how much got preserved. The trustees' minutes are in a bound book from 1886 to 1933, and then there's another bound book with the trustee minutes from about 1946-7 on. Now, there are gaps in the books, but I must say in 1950 it was really refreshing to note that the secretary of the trustees began typing the minutes. It was much easier to read. Somebody else had a question? Yes.
I just want to say that if you look at these windows, you'll see tracery around here. That's made by using a mineral called iron oxide. When the glass was created, it was applied to it. So you'll see those all over these windows.
There's lots of detail in the windows. It's not as obvious as a depiction of a biblical story, but there's symbolism in all of the windows.
You said there was the Ten Commandments up there?
There's the Ten Commandments over at the top of the window.
Window on the left, small window on the left.
Oh, I hadn't gone that far.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't go far enough, yeah, because I kept looking at the big window and couldn't find it.
We don't need to have the windows tell us stories anymore because we can read.
Right.
But in pre-literate times, the carvings and the depictions of biblical stories in windows were very important to the congregation. Yes.
The original home church that started, what country were they from?
I have no idea.
Okay.
There are not a lot of the names that would suggest some kind of heritage from one country or another. The three bishops were Thompson, Harrison, and Connell. So I'm assuming these are probably British Isles kind of folk. My family migrated into Ohio in the early 1800s in Huron County in an area that was called the Western Reserve, and the firelands, because Connecticut settlers were burned out during the Revolutionary War. They were given land in northern Ohio, and that's how my family got Erie County.
My family church was originally Germans
Ah,
in
Well,
Erie County.
in Erie County?
Erie County and Huron.
If they were German, most likely they were EUB,
Yes.
Evangelical United Brother, and that came out of Pennsylvania. That was migration from Pennsylvania. The early migration had to be by rivers because there just were no roads to carry wagons on. And later, when you begin to get highways or roads that could handle a wagon, stuff came in other ways. But it's pretty amazing how primitive this area was at the time of the War of 1812. Well, there's one other thing I wanted to show you for those of you who are Michigan, Ohio State fans. I want to go back to the picture of Ohio in 1814. Notice the northwest corner of Ohio, how high up it goes. That's not where the Valley of Ohio is anymore. Because in 1835 and 36, Michigan and Ohio fought a war over Toledo and the Maumee Basin. And the compromise was that Ohio got Toledo and Michigan got the Upper Peninsula. And notice that the western boundary of Ohio was slightly different in 1814. There are a lot of changes that have happened. Essentially, all of these counties that you see in Ohio, as the population gets bigger, the political units keep getting smaller and smaller and more compact. And if you see, at one time, Wayne County that we're in now and parts of Ashland and Holmes County were together as Wayne County. So over the 19th century, things changed pretty dramatically. Any other questions? I've kept you for a full hour. So. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So some of us would be willing to stay and see what you haven't shown us yet.
I don't have any more pictures to show.
Oh.
Wait a minute, let me check and see if I do have pictures. No, I've showed you all the pictures.
Yes. I don't think it's there anymore.
No, it's not.
It's not, yeah.
What's that?
We were talking about the defect that used to be in the stained glass windows that they removed.
In the panel directly in the center, directly above the fire rail up there. See the triangles on the side of the green part? One of them was upside down. And for years I came into the sanctuary, that's the only thing I could see was that error. And so when the windows were re-leaded in 2013, that was one of the things I pointed out to them and they corrected it. Well, thank you very much.